Hello everyone, and welcome to the Centre of Islamic Studies seminar at the University of Cambridge. It's nice to see so many people here. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm the acting director for this year of the Centre of Islamic Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the second of 4 seminars this term, which we're broadcasting here every fortnight. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome Dr. Sertach Selekolu. Dr. Selekolu is a social anthropologist who specializes in gender and subjectivity in the Middle East, with a background also in sociology. She was previously the Abdullah Mubarak Sabah Research Fellow at Pembroke College at the University of Cambridge in social anthropology and Middle Eastern studies. And she studied sociology and anthropology both in Istanbul and in Montreal at undergraduate level before completing her master's degree in social and cultural anthropology and women and gender studies at the University of Toronto. She then wrote her PhD in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge. And her work has gone from strength to strength, analyzing human subjectivity in relation to seemingly mundane and trivial aspects of everyday life. And she looks at the creative capacities of human agency, particularly interested in desire, aspiration, and longing. And she's currently a senior research associate at the UCL Institute for Global Prosperity. And she's the primary investigator on an ERC starting grant, which is entitled Imaginative Landscapes of Islamist Politics Across the Balkans to Bengal Complex. And most recently, she's the author of Working Out's Desire, Women, Sport and Self-Making in Istanbul, which has been published this year with Syracuse University Press. And last but not least, she's also a visiting fellow here at the Centre of Islamic Studies here at Cambridge. So we're delighted to have you here, Sertach, and Dr. Selekolu will speak to us for around about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of time for question and discussion after that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be invited today. Meanwhile, I'm also sharing the screen. And thank you very much, Paul, for inviting me. I would like to start with saying that this is the very first paper that was developed during the first year of this 5-year project that I'm running. Therefore, it's very much in the making. Although I was mentioning to Paul that certain ideas have been shaped when I was at Pembroke. You can consider this as results of my initial conversations between anthropology and classical Arab scholarship. I also would like to remind you that since it's written as an anthropological piece, there are parts I felt a need to introduce classical Arab scholarship to the reader. And some of those parts would be redundant here probably as a Center for Islamic Studies. I've tried to shorten those parts, yet still some introductory overviews are kept. Nevertheless, every comment, feedback, suggestion is hugely and humbly welcome. So here we go. The aim of this paper is to locate critique at the intersections of genealogy of knowledge in anthropological thinking and decolonizing movement. I connect 2-tiered set of questions as a way to inquire about the limits and possibilities of critical thinking within and beyond the decolonizing movement. In the first tier, the paper criticizes the series of work in anthropological theory that tends to somehow start their genealogies with the ancient Greek thinkers and then jump for about 2 millennia and continue with Enlightenment, omitting all the debates, conversations, and disagreements, the 3 main components of the evolution of social thought that took place in between. This leap, in other words, involves dismissal of the series of scholarly conversations and advancements that took place from roughly 400 BC to 1500s across the Mediterranean Sea. Then in this first layer, I engage with the interconnected questions of intellectual impoverishment due to omission and of method of engagement. I therefore bring in one of the many dismissed scholarship with crucial role to the genealogy of knowledge we today claim as Western, the classical Arab scholarship. By classical Arab scholarship, I refer to the large number of work written in Arabic and circulated across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of East Asia from roughly late 900s to early 1400s. The word Arab in this category of classical Arab scholarship does not refer to the ethnic background of the scholars, neither it necessarily signifies nor designifies any particular religion. Rather, it is used to refer to the language in which the individuals from various ethnic backgrounds were trained and had authored their work. In the first layer, I ask, what happens when a massive chunk of rich scholarly developments and conversations took place for as long as 700 or so years, is removed from our sense of literature, our readings of resources, including both the classical and ancient texts? What it means to have interruptions in this genealogy? What sort of epistemological scope this selective reading and referencing brings to our understanding of knowledge? Should we address such substantial gaps? And if so, how should we do that? So I'm obviously not answering each one of those questions in this talk, but laying them out so to sort of warm up. What I do in this first year, though, is to approach classical Arab scholarship as both Western and non-Western at the same time. In the second tier, I then question how of decolonizing curriculum. My main question there would be whether and how we are to engage with the native scholars in anthropology with their theories. Bear in mind that some of those theories were part of the genealogical knowledge productions, but were today dismissed. So my inquiry then inevitably has another lingering effect. Is filling the gaps enough to decolonize? To expand the layers of the second point, I take a closer look at a particular figure in classical Arab scholarship, Ibn Khaldun, his theory of the state and state-making in relation to power. I critically engage with the ways in which he is appropriated by various local regimes of power in the Middle East and various Western romanticizers. The topic decolonizing movement is highly contested, and thus it's important to clarify from the beginning that this talk does not claim a universal truth or principle about how to decolonize. What it does very clearly, however, is to take a denunciatory position against the contexts where the decolonizing movement is appropriated in non-Western contexts to silence the critical voices. Therefore, the paper also touches on the cases where the new Islamic revivalist intelligentsia and the Muslim right engage with, praise, and even use Ibn Khaldun in a selective manner that paradoxically both establish a canon that marginalizes critical voices and directly or indirectly serves to the local regimes of power. This part comes towards the end of this talk. In the conclusion, I complete my circular thinking by returning to the question of dismissal as a failure of scholarly diligence and intellectual imagination. So perhaps it would be helpful to start with reflecting on what it means to decolonize knowledge in general and decolonize anthropology in particular. With the help of Foucauldian theory on power and knowledge, anthropological knowledge has been criticized, especially in 1980s, 1990s, as a discipline emerged for Western colonization and by Western colonization. The significance of the postmodern turn in anthropology was that it has stimulated a way of thinking that questions the legitimacy of various sciences and social sciences as knowledge-making mechanisms. Just for the sake of staying in the nuanced side of the conversation and of the probe, it's important to remind ourselves one more concern in the formation of anthropology as a discipline. Anthropology as a discipline was initially established to form scientific knowledge about the colonially encountered others, and of course, through other about themselves, right? Since a large number of early anthropologists were financially supported by the colonial officers, if not acted as one, during the periods preceded the establishment of anthropology as a discipline, the knowledge produced about this encountered other was through the travel notes of the diplomats. An important number of those very popular work were about the places they have never been to and the people they have never met. So just to give one single example, this is from Richard Knowles, who published his book, General History of the Turks in 1603, without a single visit to geography he wrote about. The book became so popular that it had 7 editions. Establishing a discipline that will use scientific standards of knowledge production to study the newly encountered societies was therefore one of the rationale behind the need for a discipline like anthropology. And here is a crucial point. What is considered as scientific had not proven to provide a very reliable ground for this new discipline. The scientific requirement to be met at the time were highly problematic, namely cultural evolutionism and preoccupation for cataloging various races to fit into this unilinear sense of social progress embedded in cultural evolutionism had later become abandoned practices and methods, specifically for promoting what we today call scientific racism. Written when cultural evolutionism was considered to be an accepted fact, the language used in early anthropological texts assumed racial, social, intellectual superiority of the industrialized societies, and thus referred to Aboriginal and indigenous groups as primitives, even savages. So, from the perspective of decolonizing movement, therefore, the issue at stake was more than having racist undertones that could be discussed whether the scholars were actually racist or not. The issue at stake was how several of that work have actively contributed to the production of a knowledge that suggests and even ranks racial hierarchies, right? The postcolonial theory has challenged the scholarly legitimacy of these early work. The decolonizing movement takes a more radical position, however. Decolonizing movement has emerged out of disappointment and frustration with the way curriculums are formed and citation politics are shaped in a manner that still does not address the native scholars' critical interventions. So that is as if Franz Omar Fanon never reminded us the centrality of race and Eurocentrism in psychoanalysis and studies on self. That Edward Said never wrote hundreds of pages to demonstrate English literature is not solely English, or Gayatri Spivak has not introduced the terms essentialism and strategic essentialism to our vocabularies. That the critique of postcolonial theory was treated as fads to be moved on and moved away from. As a response, the decolonizing movement has emerged to believing that a more fundamental position is required by replacing the existing dismissive canon with the scholarship of the marginalized native scholars. So while those who support and join the decolonizing movement were taking issues with the anthropological canon for being dismissive to native scholars, the older generation of scholars in anthropology who formed the anthropological canon had another concern. Their concern was about how to keep the anthropological canon in the canon. But then how would we separate what is anthropological apart from what is not? On 31st of August in 2017, so that you're looking at the page, the renowned anthropologist Marshall Salins published a blurb on how Facebook page where he asked, where have all the cultures gone? He starts with asking what happened to anthropology as encompassing human science. Why is a century of first-hand ethnography of cultural diversity now ignored in the training and work of anthropologists? He questions the way contemporary anthropology has started dismissing its own foundational knowledge. I need to give you a warning here when I'm reading this sentence. Salins then continues with listing several examples that he believes to be removed from the recent anthropological curriculum, including Naga headhunting, Fijian cannibalism, Amazonian animism, and Aztec human sacrifice, and suggests that anthropologists are the custodians of this knowledge, and we are content to let it be forgotten. With this, Salin sparked a heated debate within anthropological circles, which was quite exciting for me to follow as a junior scholar. This position was one shared by many traditional anthropologists, especially in the UK, but also in the US and Europe, that all the critical movements and conceptual turns and waves in anthropology have actually hijacked what anthropology should be about. I will highlight a few points that are relevant to today's topic. It's important to clarify the tension that anthropology Salins refers to is a foundational anthropology that current theories were built onto and are thus no longer considered to be advanced enough to use in understanding today's world. Yet it is equally important to keep the progressive understanding and knowledge-making processes under the probe, that our contemporary knowledge is established through the past ones that were not advanced enough, but still have been part of the production processes of today's, what we perceive to be more advanced theories and frameworks. My talk today accepts the main tension in this debate on genealogy and the gaps as a productive one, and will apply it to the idea of decolonizing curriculum in anthropology by using the case of Ibn Khaldun. I join post-colonial theorist Hasan Haj, who, while responding to the conversation in the aftermath of Salin's self-declared round, that there are two kinds of critique. While some are dominating, silencing, therefore paralyzing, some other critiques continue intellectual discussions, open up new venues, and therefore they are enabling. He calls the anthropologists who are involved in the decolonizing movement to do a more productive and enabling critique of carefully dismantling the problematic elements while staying in conversation with the former generation of scholars. In other words, Haj's account, decolonizing movement is about critiquing the canon, but while doing so, creating a more thorough, detailed, stronger, and comprehensive genealogies of knowledge. If we turn to classical Arab texts at this point of conversation, we need to remind ourselves that they offer more than a simple alternative forms of knowledges. It's important to understand the classical Arab scholarship as a vast and diverse number of theories and debates that were produced at dozens of institutions connected to each other via trade routes across the Mediterranean and expands to Central Asia. It had translated and furthered the ancient Greek knowledge of philosophy and sciences. A number of work from this scholarship later on translated into European languages during Enlightenment. So here I'd like to take a moment and repeat my earlier question on why we, anthropologists and social scientists, find it acceptable, if not exciting, to use theories of the ancient Greeks, but not the classical Arab scholars. Different approaches suggest different durations for the, what this period has, for how long this period has longed, but at least for 700 years, the ancient Greeks' work in philosophy, biology, mathematics were translated, studied, and most importantly, further developed by the Arab scholars. Surely in the duration of 700 years, there must be some worthy of incorporating to our thinking, of engaging with, of giving reference to, even just to disagree. Why we skip those work altogether? What sort of analytical limits, and I think that's more important, what sort of analytical limits we establish through such gaps in the genealogy of knowledge. In fact, today we witness an exciting moment, that we are witnessing a moment with an incredible rise in applying these classical Arab scholars, such as Ibn Khaldun, Al-Ghazali, and there's an example from non-Arab scholars from Persia, of course, to core theoretical analysis in the English and French-speaking academia. So I also just want to say quickly, there was such a turn, such a period in 1920s and 30s, but I think this coming wave is much more comprehensive and extensive than that. Understanding the scope of classical Arab scholarship is quite essential in locating the Arabic language as a language of scholarship, very similar to the way English is established today in the academic world, both through economic and military domination. Sharing parallels with the link between anthropology and colonialism, the classical Arab scholarship has also started with and enabled by a military encounter. The spread of Arab conquest, followed by the emergence of Islamic empires, have led to the rise of a new scholarship that is mostly Islamic, almost all in Arabic language. The significance of politics and the way classical Arab scholarship was shaped was twofold. Sorry, here. The master-apprenticeship relationship was quite central in academic training, which meant that great scholars had an individual, scholarly, and political value. Secondly, any famous scholar, or I should say, any scholar who started making a name for himself, had to seek the protection of the rich and powerful, who were prepared to spend part of their wealth for the support of science and arts, which had them entangled with a number of politicians whom we today call as tyrants, actually. What I'd like to highlight is that the relationship between power and knowledge and the ruling elite's interest in managing it is not new to the academic world. So now, so we can start speaking about Ibn Khaldun now. I'll give you a very fast, or maybe not too fast, a very simple overview as a just reminder. Often referred to as the first sociologist, Ibn Khaldun has lived between years 1332, 1406. He was a jurist and expert in fiqh. He can also be seen as a proto-ethnographer of the other, right? In his work, as he wrote the social history of the Berbers in North Africa. There are scholars who compared him with a number of classical theorists from the West, including Max Weber, Adam Smith, Arnold Toynbee, Carl Schmitt, and Niccolò Machiavelli. Since he was an expert in fiqh, which is the theory and the philosophy of the law, Ibn Khaldun systematized the skeleton of thinking in this form of law and legality. And he was doing it so in highly secular terms, and often by using Aristotelian reasoning, which quite matters in his scholarship. His life was shaped around movements across this map you see on the screen. He was born in Andalusia and fled to Tunisia, and most of his movements were displacements due to wars taking place in his lifetime. In contemporary world, he is famous for Muqaddimah, 1377. Muqaddimah, introduction, was designed to introduce a lengthier book named Kitab al-Ihbar, the book of observations. And it is now known to the scholars of the Middle East, yet less known to anthropologists. His Muqaddimah theorized the rise and falls of human civilizations. So Muqaddimah's first chapter is an umbrella chapter that explains what he means by human civilization. He then divides them into two groups: desert civilizations and dynasties. The cultural evolutionist perspective that we criticize in the early anthropology seems to take a simpler, less categorical, but still hierarchical format here. Ibn Khaldun, what he does is to rank human societies as primitive and advanced. And then the fourth chapter is about what happens to civilizations when they stop growing, right? The last two chapters are on arts and crafts on the one hand, and sciences on the other. These two are also meant to carry suggestions actually for the civilizations who want to avoid falling into a sedentary state and collapsing, and that is mainly by, and the way to avoid this is mainly by advancing arts and sciences. Again, apologies for the repetition to those who are familiar with Ibn Khaldun, but it's important to note that he explains the rise and fall of civilizations through his concept of asabiya, often translated as tribalism. The word asabiya comes from asaba, which refers to a group of people who are bound together in a, quote, league of their own, end quote. In brief, he suggests that this bond that enables Badawi groups to be tied via loyalty and succeed. His writing on Asabiya and the dynamics of the rise and fall of dynasties in North Africa has gone on to be enormously influential for the preceding centuries. Ibn Khaldun observes Asabiya especially in tribal groups with shared religion and value system. Now, Arabs, therefore, before the big empires in easy times of Islam is the first example he gives to explain Asabiya in his book. But it can be applied to other tribal groups, he says, such as Turks, Kurds, Berbers of his time. In his account, this tribal solidarity is the key to explaining both the rise and the fall of new political powers. And he explained this in somewhat a cyclical manner. At the beginning of each cycle, a group or tribe achieves a military or cultural conquest at the expense of another fading group. Asabiya, according to Ibn Khaldun, is what gives communities a military advantage, Hadara, against the sedentary dynasties, that's Hadara. They manage this because their Asabiya makes such social groups all but irresistible on the battlefield. As the cycle progresses, having achieved victory, the same group then hand on the power to the next generation, which consolidates power. Yet in turn, once they conquered these dynasties, they became weakened by the seductions of luxury. Then a taste of luxury sets in. It leads to inexorable decline. This group becomes the next fading power, leading to be laid low by another tribe, hungry for domination and inspired by their own group feelings. And as you can see, Adamson refers to this as a very powerful theory linking culture to regime change. Ibn Khaldun's main intervention was to theorize Iberia's history of the latest 500 years until his time. I'll just show you a couple of maps actually about it. Because it's very, like a lot of information, I decided it can become too confusing at one point. But so many dynasties were rising and falling in the last 500 years of his before he was born and during his lifetime, right? So he kind of wanted to come up with a theory that explains all of these events in this geography and beyond. He was really conscious about developing a theory that can cover the geographies beyond his reach. And so there's one more point I'd like to highlight, that the connections between the Western scholarship and the classical Arab scholarship was not a unidirectional one, meaning it wasn't only Ibn Khaldun who influenced Western classical political theories. He himself was influenced by the ancient Greeks. The most important Greek scholar who influenced Ibn Khaldun would be Herodot. Here is his sculpture. Indeed, Herodot's accounts of the Scythians can be seen as a predecessor to accounts of pastoral nomadic tribes. Herodot also sought to understand the wider importance of cultural and political differences between Greeks and Persians. His writing brings many of the issues of representation that Edward Said commented on, such as his use of battle between Greeks and Persians to place Greeks and their alleged love of freedom in a positive light. So, there was another scholar that he was influenced by, whose name is Al-Masudi, but he finds it very detailed, very interesting, but he finds his writing style a little bit too entertaining. So he wants to establish himself, like Ibn Khaldun wants to establish himself as less entertaining and more scholarly. And he's very conscious about that. Okay, so the invasions that had affected Ibn Khaldun's thinking were often powered by the military strength enabled by strong tribal bonds, trying to link it to just with the conversation I mentioned before. Asabiya in Khaldunian formulation, of course, right? So it's important to note that Ibn Khaldun did not design his theory of civilization to fit a specific historical setting, as I said. So I just want to highlight that. He also gives examples from time of Prophet Muhammad and gives examples from Greeks and Persians. Okay, so if, as one of the steps towards decolonizing anthropology is to disorient the canon by making non-Western and non-Eurocentric theories and scholars central to the curriculum, then how can we use Ibn Khaldun in other anthropology papers, classes, lectures, etc.? It's also suffice to ask, as anthropologists, how can we use Khaldunian theories while, for instance, authoring articles on topics related to, like, specifically politics in the Middle East? I'm glad to know that amongst the audience, there are anthropologists who taught Khaldunian theories when they teach topics relevant to his scholarship, such as Middle East cities. I'm thinking of Alice Wilson's classes at Sussex, who is also a visiting fellow at the Center of Islamic Studies. So one of the things we highlighted was Ibn Khaldun seemed to care for developing a theory that will anatomize society, right? The historical sociology he developed is often found non-normative, although Muqaddimah can be read as a work of political philosophy, it's hard to suggest that he argues for any particular political arrangement. Muqaddimah does not attempt to explain the best way to run a society, rather it is relentlessly descriptive, with Ibn Khaldun occupying the role of all-seeing, detached observer, rather than the role of a political advocate. His writing style, combined with the novelty of his analysis, has resulted him to be referred as the first sociologist, something we have mentioned. This makes him different from European scholars like Locke or Hobbes and locates him somewhere closer to Weber. And this also explains why there's always this repetitive comparison between him and Weber and Ibn Khaldun. Like Ibn Khaldun himself, his contemporaries were very much aware that he was developing a new discipline. The scholars of his time seem to discuss and treat Asabiya as a new theory, like we do, for instance, performativity, a term and concept on its own with theoretical significance, right? But trying to engage with such classical texts, including Muqaddimah and Ibn Khaldun's work, comes with certain limits, and if I say limits, I should also say possibilities, I thought, hence the title. First of all, studying classical Arab scholars is different than studying classical theorists in contemporary social studies. The main difference is that scholars who are taught at undergraduate and graduate programs are already seen and treated as, albeit agreed to be outdated, the fathers of contemporary social theory, right? So there's a vocabulary and established way of situating the scholars like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, David Hume. I taught these scholars for several years at the university level, and students were already familiar with the conceptual world, even the particulars such as Leviathan or social contract. However, the familiarity is very limited when it comes to classical Arab texts. When it comes to the Arab scholars of classical times, there is not even a consensus about how to transliterate their names into English, into Latin alphabet more broadly. So I'm giving a couple of examples in both Arabic script and how they were attempted to be transliterated. The lack of consensus in Latin spellings of the names of Arab scholars result in inconsistencies. And these inconsistencies then grow even bigger when it comes to certain locations that do not exist anymore, right? For example, the birthplace of Al-Biruni. So is it Khwarizm? Is it Khwarezmi? Is it Khorazma? How do we pronounce it? How do we write it? Nobody knows. There are so many variations. Those who cannot read classical Arabic will, of course, have to rely on translation. some of which would be outdated, and that's the other challenge. For instance, the English translation copy of Mukaddime that I have myself is especially troubling since the translator, great translator, Franz Rosenthal, very known, very famous, professor of Semitic languages at Yale, died in 2003, did not include several of the original Arabic words Ibn Khaldun used. This leaving no room for linguistic discussions, which is always important and valuable when reading Arabic texts, and even more so when it comes to certain crucial terms. So the core term asabiya in the edition I own is repetitively translated the word asabiya as group feeling, and does not enable a conceptual discussion, which is very much present in the original Ibn Khaldun. So it's forcing me to kind of organize reading groups, which I was organizing at Pembroke, right? And even more difficult when you're trying to cite him, actually. There are also other limits which require the reader to carry the same filter they use while reading foundational figures in anthropology, attempting to find and develop universal formulations. So like in foundational figures, classical theorists, and then the Enlightenment, and in Ibn Khaldun, all of them seem to try to develop universalistic and deterministic theories, which is something we don't like anymore, right? At least in anthropology, and it's all like they all seem to like it very much. There are several points to be raised while reading Ibn Khaldun's theory vis-a-vis current post-colonial theories. One important note to be added is that in Ibn Khaldun's formulation, asabiya has its own agency and is connected to power. I'd like to remind that even his description of asabiya reads very much like a version of survival of the fittest. Luxury is seen as a source of decline, inability to maintain power. Luxury in Mukaddimah should not be confused with pleasures. And the parts where Ibn Khaldun discusses luxury, it's more similar to what we can refer to as opulence. So in Ibn Khaldun's formulation, the decline of a civilization is a result of its own weakness, its own opulence, as the civilization will no longer stay fit and connected. The civilization will indulge itself in luxury and then will be doomed to fail. And when you think about it, it's almost as if hegemonic power is formulated too uncritically, making rise a positive and fall a negative signifier, like a failure. So it's the right moment, I believe, to question that with this uncritical engagement with the workings of power, can we suggest that Ibn Khaldun's theory had a room for post-colonial critique and the way we think about it today? I think the irony here is quite valuable, and as part of the tension I have cherished at the beginning of my talk. Indeed, we can discuss the limits of Khaldunian theory, yet he still would like to be acknowledged. So I'll just read it from here. He says, I really love this part. If I have omitted some point, or if the problems have got confused with something else, the task of correcting remains for the discerning critique. But the merit is mine, since I declared and marked the way. So the guy wants to be cited, everyone. It's very obvious here. Like we all do, like Marshall Salins want to be cited. I'll mention him again. A number of contemporary, I'll stay here. A number of contemporary native scholars, including those who are part of the populist Islamist intelligentsia, attempt to explain the fall of Ottoman Empire in 20th century through Ibn Khaldun's theory by arguing that the Ottomans were seduced by luxury. In fact, several history books and Turkish curriculums still teach the collapse of Ottoman Empire within such terms. So I'm moving towards before conclusion, I'm moving towards connecting a couple of themes, couple of issues, like more about how not to read these classical texts, right? That's why I started with this example, actually. Examples where the dismissal of scholars and scholarship of certain periods within the same genealogies create ruptures in our intellectual formations. So to put simply, since all dismissals are selective, they often serve to create and reiterate a particular narrative, a narrative that is politically problematic and scholarly erroneous. Mainly, we fail to see how the European Enlightenment and the classical Arab thought have been in conversation with one another, something we highlighted, complementing and nourishing each other. This mistake is an easy fall into, since there's already an existing popular idea that suggests Islam and the West as cultural opposites of each other. However, as connected geographies across the Mediterranean Sea, the interaction was much more vibrant than the simple opposition of values. By the way, I'm not even getting into how West versus Islam are categorically wrong dualities for the sake of keeping the conversation intact. So in this, I observe three main attitudes that I find problematic. The first one is, it's basically to ignore that I have already discussed through the term dismissal. You can call it Eurocentric dismissal, right? I'm not going to repeat that. We have covered this part. The second part is romanticize. That is to romanticize these classical Arab scholars as the kind of, as the most important figures of human history or human intellectual history. And this often comes again from actually Western scholarship, but I don't think it serves very well to the purpose of my understanding of proper conversation. And there is a third one, and that is what I'm strongly critical about, which is an immediate conversation with the first category, and it is what I call the subaltern backlash. Maybe I should have called it the populist subaltern backlash. The sort of backlash here at stake is quite assertive, with establishing a number of scholarships under the name of classical Arab scholars, and Ibn Khaldun seems to fascinate many, which is why there are, you can see his name or several similar names were appropriated to contemporary Islamist politics, where there are now universities and chairs established and conferences organized under Ibn Khaldun's name, for instance. And although they appear to be part of decolonizing movement, these the members of this populist backlash are often incredibly problematic. They are basically the main parallel, I should say, is this new subaltern backlash has with the Eurocentric dismissal is how the West versus Islam dualism is used to increase their populist followership. The problem is, any scholarship written before the colonial encounter is easily accepted as Islamic, including the most secular ones, such as Ibn Khaldun's, which is acceptable. While at the same time, and that is the problematic part, any scholarship and any theory developed after 17th to 18th century Europe or North America is seen and treated as un-Islamic. One of the most repeating example you would see that they give for un-Islamic theories is Michel Foucault's theory of power. Reiterating the West versus Islam dualism allows this populist intelligentsia to establish their own canon within the very Eurocentric framework they're expected to be critical about. So before I move on, I just would like to mention that decolonizing Islam is yet to be discussed as a political project. That leaves anti-Western Islamists go unnoticed under this cloak as products of colonialism. They are the children of colonialism as a political project, and reverse colonialism is still within the same conceptual vocabularies, obviously. I'm skipping a couple of parts because we're in 41st minute. But this part I don't want to miss. I believe critique is not just a charming topic and an epistemological hypochondria, as once famously put. Critique keeps us on our toes by providing us tools for intellectual progress and achievement. So at this point, I'd like to be the boring anthropologist and reflect on the questions of critique and ontology a little bit. There is something deeply concerning when it comes to the question of critique. While on the one hand, a large number of scholars present a convincing argument that anthropologists are best at challenging established ideas and worldviews so as to expand their own, a number of others express their concerns about unreliable character of critique as an abstract form of art. This tension has been witnessed a number of times, but especially in the last 5 years. I'll quote from Didier Fassen's keynote he later on published, but the keynote was in 2016 and the European Association of Social Anthropologists, where he says we must resist both the facile disqualification of critique as a practice passé and the hyperbolic use of critique as a mere mantra, and that anthropology in general and ethnography in particular can help us succeed in this endeavor. And Fassen's position was not enough because he was trying to critique the canon while staying within the canon almost, because he was engaging with important interventionists like Foucault, Bourdieu, Latour, and Said, all impugned and even slammed the canon of their time. Yet the critique is a multifaceted process where centralizing the canon works against the very promise of the critique as an attitude, which is probably why Hage's intervention to the heated debate around Salins and his rent was especially helpful, as it was centralizing a critical attitude. Hage's suggestion was the following: to have an anthropological illusio, life pursuit, is also to believe that the labor of disentangling the white from the anthropological/universal is worthwhile. The art of producing a decolonial anthropology is the art of engaging in ethnography while also laboring on this disentanglement. One of the crucial elements of how to take critical position would be enabling a conceptually grounded critique, rather than a geographically grounded positionalities. And I believe both the Eurocentric dismissal and the populist subaltern backlash are examples to the latter, geographically grounded positionalities. That being the critical angle needed to expand the conversation and analysis to question what is today assumed as geographical and cultural other is in fact closer to us and to the formation of our own sense of self, political, cultural, and social self than we might imagine. Yet one of the reasons as to why we need decolonizing movement to keep us on our toes is related to the way ontological turn, as about theorizing the local ontologies, is appropriated to the anthropological canon. I'm trying to find the parts to skip, sorry. Instead of introducing a related question to the reader in the conclusion, I instead suggest that even if we embrace the ontological term uncritically, it is impossible to speak about the culture without studying their scholars. Or I'll just ask this as a question: how can we study a culture without studying their scholars, right? So if we want to deepen and reiterate, if we want to deepen our understanding of the ontologies of the locals, it is impossible to miss the scholarship that was shaped through the local concepts of these geographies. So at this point, as a kind of part of conclusion, I'd like to turn one of the applications and studies of Ibn Khaldun, which I find extremely helpful and extremely successful, actually. I think it's a good example to both decolonizing and rereading classics for an improved genealogy. That is by the French sociologist here on the it's my right. I think it's your right as well. Political scientist Hamid Bozarslan, known for his work on state violence and Kurdish struggle, authored an exemplary book, Le Luxe et la Violence, Approaches to Ibn Khaldun as a scholar of the state, who is critical to the state's capabilities, contradictions, and crisis. Bozarslan shows us how, according to Ibn Khaldun, state is both the creation and the creator of violence. Contrary to the way contemporary Islamist intelligentsia appropriates Ibn Khaldun, Bozarslan explains us how the notion of power, remember they were suggesting that notion of power did not exist in Islamic thinking. However, Bozarslan explains us how the notion of power is quite central in Khaldunian theory. If we read the contemporary Islamist intelligentsia's book closely, we can easily detect the repeating argument that the theories of power does not exist in Islamic thinking. Bozarslan, on the other hand, helps us trace back to Ibn Khaldun's very own definition of power, mulk, that is, do I have its definition now? A general concept designating the exercise of authority through constraint and domination, and as a concrete form of exercise of sovereignty in a determined social and political context. That's exact translation from Ibn Khaldun. Of course, admittedly, this definition does not share much parallels with Foucault's in any way, but it's still kind of taking us in a better position than trying to push Ibn Khaldun to a romanticized or romanticized corner. Okay, so as a conclusion, when I teach this material to my students, I often provide them examples from the classical texts on what they might assume un-Islamic. The one they find the most interesting amongst all the examples I provide is usually the theory of evolution, something that can be found in the writings of social scientists, biologists, and also Sufis of the classical times. An understanding of the classical Arab texts would provide a better understanding of the self and the other, as I repeat multiple times. But it also kind of breaks the populist dualisms that seem to serve quite well to the certain extreme rights that seem to be nourishing each other in the world today. Here, I'd like to finish by highlighting that decolonizing movement's immediate concern is a pivotal, scholarly speaking, that anthropology as a knowledge-making mechanism should be critical about its engagement with power mechanisms and the mechanisms that generate inequalities and even violence. At the same time, my talk today questions the way claims of decolonizing movement are appropriated to the canon, or even worse, to the operations of various power mechanisms in certain non-Western contexts. Therefore, joining Ghassan Haj very clearly, that I highlight my main driving concern that the decolonizing movement's priorities are not to be discredited despite the various directions it was interpreted with and it was taken to. Is the way it centralizes, the most important element of it is the way it centralizes critique in anthropological and social thought. Thank you very much. Just stop here.
Right. Well, sorry about the silence. I was trying to unmute myself, but thanks very much indeed, Sertach. Can you hear me? Yep. Great. Well, it's really a great talk and lots of food for thought. How we should read classical Arabic sources, how we should not read them. What does critique mean? What are the possibilities of critique? And reading all of this into the very present and exciting concerns about decolonizing the curriculum. So you've given us a lot to think about, and we have I think, around just over 30 minutes to chew over some of these ideas, to sort of pose questions and so forth. So I would ask you to, if you know how to raise your electronic hand, otherwise you can type a question in the chat function, and I will try to sort of keep appraised of who's raising their hand. So we have a question here from Y. Baiza. Perhaps Neil, would you be able to unmute?
Should be able to unmute now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
First of all, thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation, and I really appreciate the thinking behind it, particularly the last part of it, that the question that whether it's possible to research and understand a culture without researching and understanding their scholars. That's a wonderful point, and I think is a very valid point. But I have a few questions, not in the form of the critique of the presentation itself, but more for the sake of my own understanding as well, because I'm not an anthropologist. I'm coming from education background. My question is that whether these decolonization is possible in the first instance, regardless whether it's anthropology or education or political science or economy, whatever, as long as we think within the framework of the colonial mainstream of knowledge itself. Thinking in today's presentation about anthropology, if we still use anthropological tools and means, which itself is a very colonial production, but it's possible to decolonize something like that. So this is the first thing. And secondly, is it desirable to do so? Because for me, is looking from the education perspective, I see not only in the field of anthropology today, but in the field of education as well, there is a lot of issues related to Islamic education and all sorts of things, because I see a kind of reductive conflict, a reductive tension in this, rather than as a kind of pluriculture. Like instead of saying that decolonizing, why would not say that I don't know, Ibn Khaldun and a major name in the modern anthropology? Because even if we succeed in decolonizing it, and we want to teach it in universities or in schools, so what happens if the curriculum itself is based on if you put it in the, I don't know, secular liberal education or colonial system or European system? Because the education system itself is still based on this model and formula. And not only just, even if we succeed in anthropology, what about the other subjects? So what value it has at the end of the day if we decolonize it? To me, I think is more important, I mean, from educational perspective, to say that Ibn Khaldun and a few major names in the European or an American anthropological discourse to teach, let us say, to both Western as well as to Muslim students, and or regardless of Western or Muslim, because even these terms are problematic. And so also the other things that I often come across is that we also use some kind of standardization of terms, because standardization and homogenization itself is a big problem, and anthropology shouldn't do that. Let us say, is everybody who writes in English these days an English writer? I'm not an English, neither by my nationality nor by my ethnicity, but I do write in English. I'm not English. I don't consider myself as an English writer. Al-Biruni wrote, he lived in Ghazna in modern day Afghanistan. He wrote in Arabic. Is he an Arab writer? Avicenna was from Balkh, modern day Afghanistan. He has some Persian, but most of his philosophy and medicine were in Arabic. Is he an Arab writer? So anthropology is supposed to be going into the details. So these are some of the kind of thinking that I would like to put for a debate. But otherwise, I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. Should I go one by one or?
Yes, why don't you? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's you actually started with two questions, and then the two were actually connected, and then you added a third one, so it's still two in total, I guess. Is it possible to decolonize? I think what I kind of, and it's kind of related to the second part of your question too, what I find very fruitful in anthropology and anthropological thinking, is its desire and its occupation, and also the tools it has developed to move away from Eurocentric thinking, which is not something we see very well in other disciplines, such as, especially I'm kind of now thinking about international relations, right? It's very difficult to prove or disprove if a particular theorization you've developed in your international relations analysis is Eurocentric or not. Whereas in anthropology, we have ethnography, we have a kind of force to make sure our theories come from the field. And if an anthropologist is not doing it or not doing it well, then we can always say, your theory is not grounded to the field. Your theory is very abstract, right? This is not philosophy, this is anthropology. So there is something, so I think what I like about anthropology's analytical tools that I kind of find helpful is, like Erickson said, that I quoted during my talk, that there is a preoccupation with correcting the hegemonic positions in anthropology, and for that it creates those kind of analytical tools, and then it uses the same analytical tools to critique itself, which is fantastic. I don't know many social science disciplines who are able to critique itself so thoroughly, actually, and for the right reasons as well. So coming back to the very first start of your note, is it possible? I think what's important is to stimulate a debate. Do we need to go to an abstraction in terms of decolonizing? I'm not so sure. Maybe it's not helpful to come up with a very abstract, very perfect, very idealized sense of decolonized curriculum. But having that critical force is valuable, I think. But then when we have that critical force, and that's the kind of desirable part, I suppose, and it was also that what motivated me, at least my own desire, when you are creating this kind of critical turning, critical movement, or when you are joining it, there are certain things you want to keep intact. I don't know if you could catch, but in my talk I was quoting this phrase, epistemological hypochondriac. That was recently, that's a term that was recently coined, right? To refer to post-colonial critique, etc. Because people are then afraid, what happens if we are kind of we critique all the time? And that would be problematic. So I think what I'm trying to do is to make sure the critical turn is a productive one that is moving us forward. And well, if it is going to move us forward, then again, my point is we can't continue treating the scholars who had emerged from those geographies. I'm an anthropologist of the Middle East who had emerged from those geographies as informants. They are not our informants. Ibn Khaldun is not my informant. He's somebody I will scholarly engage with. So that's the kind of one of the principles I think I want to end up getting. I am wondering if anybody else is going to ask about the Arab scholar question. Should I respond to that or should I wait? Paul, what do you say?
I think you could maybe address it. We've got one more question waiting, so.
Okay, so I have given a really long talk to how to refer to the particular scholarship that I believe we should engage as the anthropologists of the Middle East, right? So we can refer to this classical Arabic scholarship that would signify the language, but the problem there would be like getting confused with the language classical Arabic, right? And the scholars who are working on it. So that's not what we are trying to get at. So many scholars are referring to Islamic philosophy, but they are specifically referring to the Islamic philosophy. Ibn Khaldun or Biruni are actually very secular in their scholarship. So, so calling them, and Ibn Khaldun specifically wanted to be secular. Al-Biruni as well. So I was actually teaching Al-Biruni and Ibn Khaldun together when I was teaching decolonizing curriculum at Cambridge. Because like Al-Biruni is the first Muslim scholar who had studied Sanskrit and Hindu religion, and he spent like 17 years, if I'm not mistaken, of his life. And there hadn't been another Muslim scholar for, I think, another 500 years who did the same work. It's kind of, it's already showing something that's quite extraordinary in terms of their effort to get into the minds of another belief, right? And that's the example from Al-Biruni, whereas Ibn Khaldun wanted to come up with a theory that will be applicable to non-Muslim societies. He invested into becoming secular author and scholar, and that's valuable. So the phrase I kind of have formulated is that classical Arab scholarship, does not refer to ethnicity, as I clarify. But it refers to the language, very similar to the way we are like English. I'm a British anthropologist, but I'm not British, right? But I'm a British anthropologist. I'm educated in British anthropology. That's kind of like Turkish origin, but like Al-Biruni was the foreigner. That's why his name is Al-Biruni, right? But he is a kind of, his scholarship is from the same intellectual links, basically. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Great, thanks very much indeed. We've got another question from Sion Odusanya. I'm sorry if I haven't pronounced the name properly, but
yeah, that's great. Hi, I just had a question. So I'm a final year student on doing my undergrad, and one thing I've always struggled with is, again, just reiterating the previous question, which is the idea of how do we engage with scholars beyond the kind of curriculum that we're kind of given, and I guess, you know, what does that mean in practice? So how would you recommend it's a good way as a student to kind of engage with these scholars, but then at the same time not be discredited at the expense of it? Because I think sometimes that is something that happens, and you know, the idea of engaging, yeah, I really like that quote that you said before, that if we're engaging with different cultures, then let's even use the scholars themselves, and I think that's really interesting. But I guess, what does that mean in practice, and how can students like myself actually do that?
Thank you. That's a great question, actually. I can tell you how I dealt with it. So my former work was on self-making processes. And self is something that's been theorized actually in the geography. I did my fieldwork. I was doing fieldwork in Turkey, and although, you know, it's like Al-Ghazali is not a Turkish-speaking scholar at all, but his theory was appropriated quite heavily, and is kind of, it makes immediate sense to people when you talk about and think about self and desire, and how self and desire are connected. And it makes similar sense if you think about desire from Aristotelian perspective. So one of the things that was kind of that I needed to deal with was how Greek philosophy is not like geographically, but also intellectually far from Turkey, right? Same for the classical Arab philosophy and theories. So I was able to connect these kind of two different theories of selfhood and desire in my discussion. That's kind of, so it's kind of goes down to what you are writing about, I suppose. You can always drop me a line, and we can, I don't know your field, but when it comes to certain theoretical interests, if you can find a scholar from the kind of, you know, ancient Greek text, if you can find some theory that will be relevant to your discussion from the ancient Greek philosophy, you can probably find the similar conversation that took place in the Middle East. That by assuming if you are working on the Middle East. If not, then you need to ask when you are doing ethnographic fieldwork, you need to ask your interlocutors to open up what they mean by, I don't know, beauty, what they mean by desire, what they mean by self, what they mean by XYZ. And you can always ask, what is their kind of intellectual references while phrasing? So it's kind of, it's always better, I think, to trace these local scholars from the minds of your interlocutors. And of course, treating local intellectuals as colleagues is also important, because there would be some elements that, if I wasn't Turkish, or let's say if I'm doing research in Bosnia, there would be some elements that I found just interesting in the interview, but I wouldn't see its connection to the local scholarship, right? So I will need help in that, and that help would come from the educated locals. And again, I'll stop here. I hope it helped. If it didn't help enough, you can always drop me a line. Maybe we can have a conversation.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. We have a question actually from Asma Saeed, whose microphone is not functioning, so I'm going to read it out, and it's about the idea that you can think about Ibn Khaldun as secular, and so the question is whether you are whether the term secular is being used, if you like, uncritically in referring to him as secular. And this is drawing on Talal Asad's ideas that actually we need to think about the secular as a sort of historically specific form of power, which is a rather modern form of power.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. That's something we have discussed very extensively. Actually, I was running this reading group at Pembroke. Is critique Islamic ? Was the name of the reading group, and I kind of have thought, we have given a great thought about it. I think it's one of the subjects that we should, if we are going to mention it in any article, we have to mention it in a manner that will be explanatory and understandable to the reader, right? So you might know how anthropologists talk about, a local term that's not translatable, but it has to be expanded, open up, and then you continue. You first give a kind of very brief, not very brief, very detailed explanation, and then you continue with using the local term. So calling Ibn Khaldun secular was not my discovery, but I am quite convinced in terms of how shall I say, how his position was juxtaposed against certain contemporary Islamic formations, the Islamic knowledge-making mechanisms, right? So even though he was a scholar of fiqh, the way he was using fiqh was trying to make sure it is addressable and adaptable to all religions other than Islam. So maybe you might like what Hamid Bozarslan referred to him as. He said sociologically and culturally Muslim to refer to Ibn Khaldun. And even that wasn't just, enough for me. So in my text, what I prefer is to explain what I mean by calling Ibn Khaldun secular, because we also need to keep in mind that we are writing in a time that, post-secular turn took place, right? So it's almost like our conceptual world has already been broken, right? Even those who are not referring to themselves, I don't know if you're familiar with Humaira Iktidar's scholarship, and she works on South Asia. Actually, she's giving a talk right now at another institution at Cambridge. But she's actually studying how these political Islamists are following a very secular agenda and promoting a very secular agenda. But you can only do provide such discussions if you have space to open these up. My perspective is it's important to acknowledge how Ibn Khaldun's scholarship is applicable to contemporary sociology and anthropology, because of his ability to move beyond just the kind of move beyond religious inclinations, if it makes sense. But it also connects to the very first question I got, that anthropology is a secular knowledge-making mechanism, right?
Great, thanks very much for the question and for the answer.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm looking to scan my screens to see if any other questions are, if I've missed any. Let me, so that's just follow on from the previous questioner. And I wanted to know a little bit more about the Islamist intelligentsia, as you put it, sort of drawing on Ibn Khaldun, in a way, reading Ibn Khaldun in a way which you think doesn't necessarily open new critical perspectives. And I suppose the one thing that came to my mind is is Sabah Mahmood and her work in the anthropology of Islam, and in the school of Talal Asad, the anthropology of secularism, who I understand has also been seen as adopted by or seen as an inspiration within, if you like, Islamist intelligentsia circles, who sort of take up her work and Talal Asad's work and see it actually as a useful critical place from which to think. And of course that work, Talal Asad's work and Sabah Mahmood's work, has been very influential within anthropology more broadly, because it gives a place to stand, to think about liberalism, and to think about and to challenge the universal claims of liberalism and secular liberalism, and, as the previous questioner said, exactly to historicize those formations. So I wonder whether actually some of the Islamist sort of readings of whether Sabah Mahmood or potentially Ibn Khaldun are actually critical in that positive sense that you identified, of opening up new ways to think, which sort of escape the dominant discursive formations.
I have been actually joining so many conversations with various groups, with various institutions, in that group that I refer to as this. It's really hard to find the right term. I call it Islamist intelligentsia, but I also want to highlight the populist element in that intelligentsia, because so just let me start with how popular Talal Asad and Edward Said are in those circles, without necessarily knowing, the kind of like, especially with the Talal Asads, one of the like the repeating conversations I found myself into was suggesting that in the way Talal Asad was imagined, anthropology and a colonialism book, was as if a Muslim is critiquing anthropology, right? So just, giving you this picture would kind of, I think, would give you how black and white things can turn into and how problematic that is. Like the same for a couple of institutions at the universities on post-colonial, I think there was this Postcolonial Institute for Postcolonial Studies, right? They have been using the postcolonial theory as a way to silence and reduce the critical voices coming from themselves. So what I really want to highlight here is the following. What's valuable in anthropology is it is able to create its own critique to itself. Talal Asad was able to develop post-colonial critique because he was an anthropologist and he used the tools of anthropology. His critique was also a self-critique, right? And he was also using Western theory. He actually started his critique to anthropology of religion from, like, by analyzing Christianity itself, right? Kind of, so he's quite good in this notion of self-critique. So what happens when you use those discourses, the discourses derived from a self-critique coming from anthropology, directed to anthropology, to stop self-critique, to disable self-critique? And that's exactly what's happening actually in various parts of the Middle East, but especially in Turkey. I have more expertise in Turkey, right? So then all of a sudden, any kind of maybe left-wing, maybe non-right, non-left, no-wing scholars who are trying to develop a critique about inequalities, about freedoms, about, you know, Kurdish issues. Khalid Bozarsan was one of them, right? About, you know, critiquing state violence, right? Can then easily be silenced by saying, oh, the tools you are using are actually Western, so you don't understand us, you don't understand our workings. And then all of a sudden, all these valuable critiques are silenced because they come from, maybe they use a Foucauldian perspective, or even if they use the word power in it, then all of a sudden this is a Western and that's a colonial perspective, and you have a colonial mind and you are occupying our minds, and then it's discredited. And I think it's getting into a very worrying level. There are some parts I wanted to say more, but maybe you can ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's given a very, very nice, clear answer to my question around the importance of self-critique. In fact, it came from a position of self-critique. Now, I don't want to hog the floor, so are there any...
I think I saw Shuruk. If you are the Shuruk, I know. Hello. Salam.
Shuruk, please do go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Salam, Sertach.
We met, right? You are the Shuruk, I know.
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Oh, nice.
Thank you so much. It was really fascinating, and especially how you query decolonization. I enjoyed it very much. I just want to revisit the point on the secular, but maybe from the angle of the Islamic. What constitutes the Islamic for you? Because I think when we use the terms Islamic versus the secular, or the other way around, we're sort of projecting a contemporary construction on the Islamic as narrowly religious in the modern sense of religious, which Shahab Ahmad, for example, critiqued quite interestingly by expanding the Islamic in cultural and historical terms. So I just wonder what your take on this is.
Yeah, I think my take is it has so many levels, actually. So I just want to start with reminding that my former research was on exercising women, right? And one of the things that was making me very uncomfortable is because all my interlocutors were Muslim women. Every time I present a paper, my audience expected me to say a little bit more about their distinctive Muslimhood. Right. So once I remember doing a presentation in a changing room, women's gaze in changing rooms where women actually change bras. And the first question I got was, how do I define veil? Like, why do I need to define veil? So then I kind of engaged with, if you're familiar with Samuli Shelke from, Anthropology of Islam again, I ended up engaging more with Samuli Shelke's scholarship because it was kind of more applicable, that, this preoccupation with Islam and trying to see like when the individuals have multiple subjectivities and multiple subject positionings, try to see only the Muslim one, only the Islamic one is a problematic one. Okay, it comes from a very particular, I don't want to say Islamophobic, but a particular Eurocentric preoccupation that it's a way of making the Muslim subject other. Okay, So because then everything will be related to this non-understandable and non-intelligible and non-compatible to European values Islam, right? And then there would be no like conversation. So one of the things that I'm kind of very conscious about, what the audience that we are addressing will hear, and as soon as they hear, what will they try to reduce it to? And what is Islamic for me? I know what Islamist is. It's very kind of clear. It has a very clear definition, I suppose. But the Muslimhood and Islamic and the pious, they require more ethnographic information before I put a label on it, to be honest, if it's a good answer.
Thanks, Sharuk. Did you want to?
If you can ask a follow-up question, I would be happy. It's a very exciting conversation to me, actually. And like, maybe I can say one more thing about it, that kind of, I like Shahab Ahmed because he had the space, right? And like I had mentioned when I was answering the questions on the secular mind, secularism is very historical, but the secular mind is something we can, if we have the space, which I had to cut down so much part of this paper actually, really, and that's the shortened version. Seriously, Paul, I apologize. Then once you have that space, it's easier, I think, to maneuver through.
Great, thanks. I think Sharuk was unmuting.
Is she? Oh yeah, she's still muted.
I mean, I think one thing that struck me when you were talking, Sertaç, also is it may even be possible to read Ibn Khaldun's theory actually as a rather moralizing one. I mean, I know that you said it's descriptive rather than normative, but the emphasis on sort of, the weakness of luxury, I could see how it could be appropriated by a sort of a moralizing.
Yeah, actually, he was also like, he had to juggle with, and these are the parts I had to remove from my talk, actually. He had to juggle with a lot of denominators at his time, right? He was working with Timur Lenk. He was like under the guardianship of him, and he was offered some financial support from Pedro. These are like huge tyrants who are like very scary figures. So he had to find this tone, which is again related to this question of secular voice. By the way, anyway, I should that secular voice he ended up finding, because otherwise, like his suggestions would be quite penalizing. They would be quite like the repercussions would be quite difficult to deal with, I suppose. So he kind of found this neutrality, the tone of neutrality, as a solution, I believe, to his very difficult situation.
Great, thanks. And we've got a last question from William Ryle Hodges.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to ask about the comparison between Khaldun and Foucault, and I like this idea of avoiding a romanticization of the other, and it's helpful to see equivalents in Western scholarship and other geographies of scholarship. But then I was wondering, is there the danger that we, in looking for equivalence, we then exclude the possibility of new categories of thought, of opening up new ways of thinking and decolonizing, I suppose, our thought on the level of thought, and not just on the level of which theorist we look at. So I was wondering, in what way do you see someone like Ibn Khaldun decolonizing our epistemological horizons?
Yeah, I kind of was quite light on that part, wasn't I? That's why I was finishing my piece with Hamid Bozarslan, because when we try to read Ibn Khaldun just as a theorist or just as a philosopher, which a large majority of the existing biographies or analysis of his research seem to be doing, that we won't be, we'll be out of time soon. Okay, we won't be able to understand or kind of engage him to our social scientific approaches. Whereas, and then all of a sudden we would be saying things like, he doesn't talk about power, he talks about power. It's kind of these kind of very conflicting accounts sometimes we would have about Ibn Khaldun, because we would be treating him like just a theorist and that's it. Whereas if we are able to understand his scholarship in relation to his time and what he was trying to do, because he actually had an academic but also political agenda, I believe. So if we understand, and Hamid Bozarsan was exactly trying to do that. He was trying to understand his political agenda, right? He was trying to kind of, like Paul said, with his kind of sort of moralizing tone, he was trying to teach the kings, right? Teach the rulers how to rule. They like to kind of stop getting into luxury, but also invest into sciences and arts, like these kind of suggestions he was actually having. Then we can also expand his theory a little bit further. And one of the benefits, I believe, of engaging with not just Ibn Khaldun, but with the local scholars is, like I said, we won't end up being the silenced critiques of the local problematic movements, including the populist right in the East or in the Middle East. Then our theories would make more sense to the locals. And then I think in the long run, that's much more valuable. Yeah.
Thanks.
Wonderful, Sertaç. Thank you very much indeed for this wonderful presentation and for the questions and the way you've answered them. I can see there are more questions that have appeared or comments in the chat function, and it's you've definitely stimulated a lot of a rich vein of discussion. Something I'll be thinking about certainly, and I'm sure many people will. So please, could we all show our appreciation for Dr. Sertaç Sehlikoglu.
Thank you very much for coming. I really thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you, Paul, for inviting me.
Yeah, great pleasure. Right, well, I think we will have to leave it there, and hopefully we'll see many of you. I know Sertaç is a particularly popular speaker, but hopefully we'll see many of you in 2 weeks' time for our next presentation too.
See you.
Thanks, Sertaç.
Thank you.